The telegram arrived at 3:17 a.m. on February 14th, 1962. Louis Armstrong was in his dressing room at the Blue Note in Chicago, still wearing his sweat-soaked white shirt from the midnight show, when the Western Union boy knocked on the door. The kid couldn't have been more than 16, skinny as a rail, with nervous eyes that kept darting away from Louis's face. "Mr. Armstrong? Got a wire for you, sir?" Louis looked at the yellow envelope in the boy's trembling hand. In his 61 years on Earth, telegrams in the middle of the night never brought good news. But he took it anyway, fishing $1 from his pocket for the kid. "Thank you, son. You get yourself home safe now." The boy nodded and disappeared into the Chicago night, leaving Louis alone with whatever news was waiting inside that envelope. He set it on his dressing table next to his trumpet and stared at it for a long moment. Outside, the wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the windows of the club like it was trying to get in. Louis Daniel Armstrong had built his entire life on bringing joy to people. That smile, that laugh, that trumpet sound that could make angels weep. It was all about lifting folks up, making them forget their troubles for a while. But what people didn't know, what he never let them see, was the weight he carried, the price he paid for being the man who always had to smile. He opened the telegram. "Father dying. Stop, come home. Stop, hurry. Stop. Mama Lucy." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. William Armstrong, his father. The man who had walked out on Louis and his mother when Louis was just 5 years old, leaving them to scrape by in the worst neighborhood in New Orleans. The man who had never once come to hear his son play, never acknowledged that the little boy from Jane Alley had become the most famous musician in the world. Louis sat down heavily in his chair and stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face was still painted with the remnants of performance, the wide smile that had charmed presidents and paupers alike. But behind that smile, something was breaking. The last time he'd seen his father was 1943, 19 years ago. Louis had been playing at the Creole Palace in New Orleans, and William had shown up backstage, drunk and asking for money. Louis had given him $50 and watched him stumble back into the night. He never expected to see him again. But now William was dying, and somehow, some way, Louis was supposed to care. He picked up his trumpet, running his fingers along the familiar brass surface. This horn had taken him from the poorest streets in America to stages around the world. It had made him rich, famous, beloved. But it couldn't fill the hole that a missing father had left behind. There was a knock at his door. "Pops?" It was Joe Glazer, his manager, a short, stocky man with a cigar permanently wedged between his teeth. "You okay in there? I saw the Western Union kid leaving." "Come in, Joe." Glazer entered and took one look at Louis's face. "What's wrong?" Louis handed him the telegram. Glazer read it quickly, then looked up with concern. "I'm sorry, Pops. I know this is hard." "Is it?" Louis asked, surprising himself with the bitterness in his voice. "Should it be hard? Man walked out on us when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, never sent a dime, never wrote a letter. Hell, I'm not even sure he knows I'm famous." But even as he said the words, Louis knew they weren't entirely true. It was hard. It was devastating. Because somewhere deep inside, the 5-year-old boy who had watched his father walk away was still waiting for him to come back. "What do you want to do?" Glazer asked. Louis looked at his schedule for the next 2 weeks. Sold-out shows in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. Thousands of people counting on him to be there, to be Louis Armstrong, to be the man who made everything all right. "Cancel the tour," Louis said quietly. Glazer nearly choked on his cigar. "Cancel? Pops, do you know what that'll cost? The contracts alone?" "I said cancel it, Joe." There was steel in Louis's voice that Glazer had rarely heard. In 30 years of managing the world's most famous jazz musician, Joe Glazer had seen Louis handle racist hotel clerks, abusive club owners, and death threats with that same easy smile. But this was different. This was Louis Armstrong the man, not Louis Armstrong the entertainer. "All right," Glazer said finally. "I'll make the calls." 6 hours later, Louis was on a train heading south. He could have flown. He had the money. But somehow the slow rhythm of the rails felt right. It gave him time to think, time to remember. He thought about his childhood in New Orleans, growing up in back of town with his mother, Mayanne. She had been everything to him, mother, father, best friend. She had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed, taking in laundry, cleaning houses, doing whatever it took. And when little Louis got into trouble, stealing fruit from the market, or getting into fights, she never gave up on him. It was Mayanne who had scraped together the money for his first cornet when he was 13. It was Mayanne who had made him practice every day, even when the neighbors complained about the noise. It was Mayanne who had believed in him when nobody else did. William Armstrong had never been part of that story. The train rolled through Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas. With each mile south, Louis felt himself moving backward in time, becoming the scared little boy who had wondered why his daddy didn't love him enough to stay. He arrived in New Orleans on February 16th, just as the sun was setting over the Mississippi River. The city looked smaller than he remembered, more worn down. The French Quarter was still beautiful, but the neighborhoods where he'd grown up seemed to have gotten even poorer in the years since he'd left. His cousin Clarence picked him up at Union Station in a battered Ford truck. Clarence was Mayanne's nephew, a tall, quiet man who had stayed in New Orleans and worked the docks his whole life. "How is he?" Louis asked as they drove through the familiar streets. "Bad," Clarence said. "Real bad. Doctor says maybe a day or 2. Cancer got him all through his insides." They rode in silence for a while. Then Clarence said, "He's been asking for you, Louis, every day for the past week. When's my boy coming home?" "That's all he says." Louis stared out the window at the shotgun houses and corner stores of his childhood. "His boy," he repeated. "That's rich." "I know you got your feelings about him," Clarence said carefully. "We all do. But he's still your daddy cousin, and he's dying." The house where William Armstrong lay dying was a small Creole cottage on the backside of Trem. Louis had never been there before. His father had moved there sometime in the 1950s, living with a woman named Dolores, who had taken care of him as his drinking caught up with him. Dolores met them at the door. She was a small, light-skinned woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Mr. Louis," she said, and he could hear the awe in her voice. "I can't believe you're really here. I've been playing your records for him every day. 'Hello, Dolly' is his favorite." She led him through a tiny living room decorated with old photographs and religious candles to a back bedroom. The smell hit him first: medicine, sickness, the particular odor of a body giving up its fight. And there, in a narrow bed covered with a faded quilt, was William Armstrong. Louis had to grip the doorframe to keep from stumbling. The man in the bed bore almost no resemblance to the father he remembered. William had always been tall and strong, with powerful hands from his work on the docks. Now he was skeletal, his skin yellow and papery, his eyes sunken deep in his skull. But when those eyes opened and focused on Louis, something flickered there. Recognition. And something else. Was it pride? "Louis," William whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "My boy, you came." Louis walked slowly to the bedside, feeling like he was moving underwater. This was his father. This dying man had given him life, given him his name, given him the stubborn streak that had carried him from the gutter to greatness. "Yeah, Daddy," Louis heard himself say, the word strange on his tongue after all these years. "I'm here." William tried to sit up, but he was too weak. Louis helped him, propping pillows behind his back. His father's skin felt like paper in his hands. I've been following your career," William said, each word an effort. "In the papers, on the radio. My son, the famous man." Louis wanted to be angry. He wanted to say, "Where were you when I needed you? Where were you when I was scared and hungry and Mama was working herself to death?" But looking at this broken man, all he felt was a deep, aching sadness. "I'm sorry, Louis," William continued. "I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I was young, and I was scared, and I was selfish. But I want you to know I was proud. Every time I heard your name on the radio, every time I saw your picture in the paper, my chest would swell up. That's my boy. I'd tell anyone who'd listen. That's my son." Tears were running down Louis's cheeks now, and he didn't care. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you ever come see me play?" William closed his eyes. "Because I was ashamed. Because I knew I didn't deserve to be in the same room as what you'd become. Because I was afraid you'd look at me and see nothing but failure." "But I needed you," Louis said, his voice breaking. "I needed my daddy." "I know," William whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They sat together in silence for a while, father and son, two strangers connected by blood and loss and the weight of unspoken years. Outside, New Orleans was coming alive with its evening rhythms, music floating from nearby clubs, laughter from the streets, the eternal pulse of a city that never stopped dancing. "Will you play for me?" William asked suddenly. "Will you play me a song?" Louis had left his trumpet at Dolores's request. She'd thought the sound might be too much for William's weak heart. But now he understood why he'd really been called home. Not for forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for this moment. This one last song for a dying man who had never heard his son play. "I don't have my horn, Daddy." William smiled, a ghost of the charming grin that had won Mayan's heart all those years ago. "Then sing for me, son. Sing me something beautiful." Louis took his father's hand in his own, feeling how fragile it was, like a bird's wing. And then, in that small, dim room, with death hovering in the corners and forgiveness hanging in the air like incense, Louis Armstrong began to sing. He sang "When the Saints Go Marching In," his voice deep and rich and full of all the pain and joy he'd collected in 61 years of living. He sang it slow and tender, like a lullaby, like a prayer, like a goodbye. When he finished, William was crying. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he whispered. "My boy, my talented boy." They talked through the night, about music, about New Orleans, about the life that might have been if William had been brave enough to stay. As dawn broke over the city, painting the walls of the little room with golden light, William Armstrong took his last breath with his son's hand in his own. Louis sat with the body for a long time after Dolores came in and confirmed what they both knew. He looked at his father's face, peaceful now in death, and tried to feel something besides emptiness. The funeral was small, just family, and a few neighbors who had known William in his final years. Louis paid for everything, of course, and he sang at the service, his voice carrying over the small crowd gathered in St. Louis Cemetery. As they lowered William Armstrong into the ground, Louis thought about the strange mathematics of love and loss, how you could miss someone who had never really been there, how you could mourn not just for what was, but for what might have been. After the funeral, Louis walked alone through the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The house where he and Mayan had lived was gone now, torn down for urban renewal. But he could still see it in his mind, the tiny rooms, the outdoor kitchen, the front steps where he'd first learned to play his cornet. Mayan had been dead for 20 years now, but he could still feel her presence in these streets, her love, her sacrifice, her unwavering faith in the skinny little boy who dreamed of making music. She had been his real parent, the one who had shaped him into the man he'd become. But William had been part of him too, he realized now. The wanderlust that had taken Louis all over the world, the stubborn independence that had let him stand up to segregation and racism, the complicated relationship with love and loss that colored every song he sang, it had all come from somewhere, and maybe some of it had come from a tall, charming man who had been too afraid to stay and watch his son grow up. 3 days later, Louis was back on stage in Chicago, playing for a sold-out crowd at the Blue Note. From the outside, nothing had changed. He was still Satchmo, still the grinning ambassador of joy, still the man who made everything all right. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. When he played Hello, Dolly that night, there was a depth to it that hadn't been there before, a weight that came from understanding that love was complicated, that families were broken and beautiful, that sometimes the most important conversations happened when it was almost too late. In the months that followed, Louis would rarely speak about his father's death. When reporters asked about his brief absence from touring, he would just smile that famous smile and change the subject. But those who knew him well, his wife Lucille, his closest friends, they could hear the difference in his playing. There was a new richness there, a fuller understanding of what it meant to be human. Louis Armstrong lived for 9 more years after that February night in New Orleans, and he spent every one of those years carrying both the weight and the gift of that final reconciliation. He learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, and love wasn't about getting what you deserved. Sometimes the most profound connections happened in the space between words, in the silence between notes, in the brief moment when two broken people reached across the darkness and found each other's hands. The man who had made millions of people smile had finally learned to make peace with his own tears, and in that peace he found a deeper joy than he had ever known, the joy of understanding that even the saddest songs could be beautiful, that even the most difficult truths could set you free. When Louis Armstrong died in 1971, among his personal effects was a photograph he had carried in his wallet for the last 9 years of his life. It was a picture of William Armstrong from the 1930s, standing on the New Orleans docks with his work crew. On the back, in Louis's careful handwriting, were 4 words: "My father, forgiven, loved." Because in the end, that's what it all came down to. Not the fame, not the money, not the applause that had filled arenas around the world. Just a son and a father finding each other in the darkness, singing one last song before the final curtain fell.